Hey there, comrades. Welcome to this live stream of The Revolution Report. My name's Donald. If you don't already know me, I'm the host of The Revolution Report and editor-in-chief. Now, today, obviously, you joined to understand whether life under communism was good or bad. Because we often hear this, sort of cliche, something I consider a myth that, oh, anyone who likes communism in the West likes it because they never had to live under it. Well, to discuss this myth, I'm really glad to say that I'm joined today by Carlos, who is the director of the MidWestern Marx. Is it an institute already, Carlos? Yes, the MidWestern Marx Institute. They do great work over there, and we've had some joint live streams before, and it's really an honor to be able to discuss topics like this with you, Carlos, and Eddie, and the other people at MidWestern Marx, especially this one because I think it's a really commonly propagated sort of myth about communism, and it's really easily propagated in the West, obviously, because the only people that come from communist countries and live in the West, the only thing they're going to say are bad things about it, because obviously they're the ones who ran away or fled communist countries. By and large, they're going to have bad things to say about it, right? Because they actually made that decision. But the reality is that the vast majority of people living under communist countries never really, thought about running away. And the reason why, these communist parties say that they represent the people is because, the vast majority of the population in communist countries that exist today obviously have support. Are supporting communist parties there. So this is what I wanted to talk about. Carlos, I know you're Cuban yourself, and you have some stories from people who lived in Cuba or live in Cuba during, obviously, the governance of the Communist Party. So why don't we start with some of the stories you have that might contradict this narrative that we hear so often in the West?
Well, first, Donald, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to join you here. That is, I think it's a very important topic that we're talking about today, because the first thing that's brought up in the West when you speak about a communist country favorably is, why don't you move to X country, right? And as of most recent, because the principal target of the new Cold War is China, the comment or question has been, why don't you move to China? And interestingly enough, I think that the answer that we always provide is one that would be kind of weak of us. That would show a sign of an absence of courage, because we are Americans to a certain extent, and our fight is here. Why go to China where they already achieved their revolution and are already in the process of constructing socialism? Our fight is here. And two, at a more personal level, as a Marxist philosopher myself, the amount of opportunities that I would have in China, writing and teaching, would be tremendously more than in a Western academy that's very hostile to Marxist-Leninist philosophy. So I don't go, not because I don't actually agree it's really better, and I'm just lying to people. We don't go precisely because we have a commitment to do something here, to uplift our people here. As far as Cuba, there's many stories that I can pull from. One of the ones that I always bring up that signifies the transformation that occurred, not just in terms of institutions and property relations and ownership, but at the very human level, which is something that the Cuban Revolution emphasized from the beginning. Che Guevara was an avid reader, of course, of the young Marx, whose manuscripts are being published and translated to Spanish. The early manuscripts from the early 1840s are being published and translated to Spanish right around the time of the Cuban Revolution, specifically the Paris manuscripts on alienation and stuff, where there's a more warm current of Marxism, emphasizing the humanistic aspects of it. Che Guevara, on this basis, he held, elaborated most famously in Socialism and Man in Cuba, that the revolution is not just about changing property owning relations or transforming the state, and it's really at its core, it succeeds ultimately when it's able to transform human beings, when the sort of valuative systems that are anti-life and basically anti-human, that are promoted by the capitalist mode of life, greed, the do what you have to do to get ahead by bringing others down, and other similar forms of degenerative social values, Uh, we're attempting to overcome those by producing a new type of human being. And so the idea was that really the Cuban Revolution can be seen to have succeeded, not just when the institutions are changed, but when it becomes evident that a new human being has been produced. The story that I always bring up as to how, at least at the immediate level, I saw the realization of that was from my grandfather. My grandfather was a Catholic seminarian when the revolution occurs. As the revolution wins within the first few years, one of the first things they do is send out brigades of young people, educated young people, to build hospitals and clinics in rural areas that didn't have access to medicine, to build schools in areas that were largely illiterate. And my grandfather was part of these brigades. By the way, what's often left out of the Gusano narrative, and I can explain that word Gusano and why it's used later, but what's often left out of the people that were incarcerated and the narrative that you get from Miami about Cuba being just a dictatorship, a hellhole where my grandpa and grandpa's grandpa was was incarcerated or jailed or killed or whatever. It comes from the fact that in these brigades right after the revolution, the reactionary forces, the forces that stood with Batista and with that were in favor of U.S. intervention in the island, they would get some of these brigades of young men and women, and they would literally hang them, and they would just slaughter them. And it is on that basis that there's reactions to that. But my grandfather was part of these brigades, and I remember asking him at one point, because I grew up with my mom telling me how much he overworked, how he would often stay at work after hours, and those parts of the family that would joke and say that he was just messing around with women or something or being mischievous. But I asked him one day, why do you do that? And he told me that it's because if I get to finish the project that I'm working on with my crew, that means that another part of this province is able to get water sooner and not have to wait till Monday or something. So the reasons why he would work were not simply for personal gain. They were very conscious about the social good that the work would produce. So when as I develop as a Marxist philosopher, engage with literature from our tradition and with Che, I was able to think back at those stories of my grandpa telling me this, and at the time I never understood it. I was still within the sort of valuative system of bourgeois morality. And I've come to understand that more and more that what the revolution produced was a new man, and or a new person, and that an example of that was my grandfather, someone who was working for the sake of the common good, for the sake of society itself. And if that meant enduring various forms of sacrifices at the personal level, at the family level, it was all worth it for this transcendent cause that serves humanity and specifically Cuba.
That's actually really fascinating, the story you spoke about in terms of your grandfather, because the first thing that comes to my mind is what I've heard from the generation and read about in both textbooks and primary source accounts of people who lived during the Stalin era in the Soviet Union, actually during the era of specifically the first and second 5-year plans, because that was when obviously the Soviet Union rapidly industrialized, right? And obviously opponents of socialism will say, oh, this was like the reason for these successes were built upon the backs of slaves or whatever, gulag labor, and that could not be farther from the truth based on actual primary source of accounts that we have of people who, for example, participated in the construction of the city of Magnitogorsk. We can use that as an example. This city was a tundra at the beginning of the first 5-year plan. And by the end of the second 5-year plan, it became one of the most important industrial cities of the entire Soviet Union. A city that is still one of the most important industrial cities of the Russian Federation to this day. And that was not built on the backs of slaves. This was, by all primary accounts, built by the hands of workers that had social good as their interest. And they also did exactly what your grandfather was describing, right? They worked absolutely insane shifts. Essentially, they worked without break. They worked without thinking about leisure time, because they understood that building this city of Magnitogorsk was going to help the country prepare for the inevitable, what they already knew at the beginning of the 1930s, the inevitable reaction of Western finance capital to the socialist experiment that they were already planning on launching in the late 20s, and it only really was put on the back burner by Western capitalist countries because the Great Depression happened. The Soviet Union knew that there was going to be some sort of capitalist attack on the socialist experiment in the Soviet Union, and it came in the form, obviously, of fascism, of Adolf Hitler, and what the Russians and Soviets considered to be the Great Patriotic War. And there were even also, another thing that needs to be mentioned in terms of the another really important factor in the great construction of socialism in the Soviet Union were the young Communist League, essentially, which in Russian was called the Komsomol. They were, like you described in the Cuban experiment, educated young people who were ready to contribute to society, build socialism. They were sent out to all parts of the country to help fulfill the 5-year plan, and they made up what were called labor shock brigades, because they were the ones that were sent into the most difficult parts of the 5-year plan, the most difficult parts of the country for the construction of socialism. And you listen to people who lived through that. Obviously, there's not that many that are left from that time period still living, but you can read primary source accounts of people who lived through that time period, and almost nobody talks about it as a time of suffering, as a time of hardship. They talk about it as a period of great upheaval, of something that they were proud of, that they were able to build their country during this period. And that's why, like, when we hear people talking about telling us that people in the West like communism only because they didn't live under it, reality completely contradicts this statement, because the people in the Soviet Union, the generation that I would say is the most and was the most hardcore communist, the most unyielding in its dedication to the ideas of Marx, Lenin, Engels, was the generation that lived under Stalin, right? Obviously, we can examine individual excesses of that time period, but for the generation that actually lived under it, to by and large remember it fondly, we can't characterize it as something that was just absolutely horrible. In fact, it's only as the generations from the revisionist period get later and later, where obviously there were more compromises being made, more retreats from socialist construction. Only as those generations start to appear do we start to hear more people from these generations saying bad things about socialism, saying that socialism was bad. In fact, I would say the Soviet generation that has the most bad things to say about the Soviet Union in its specific experience was the last generation, the ones that grew up under Gorbachev. They associate Gorbachev and the late socialist period with socialism, even though we understand that it was already almost entirely capitalist during the late period of Gorbachev, and that's exactly why things were so bad. Because the period of stagnation was not even nearly as bad as the consequences that we saw from Gorbachev's, capitalist economic reforms in the Soviet Union. I mean, like, would you say that your studies in Marxism corroborate that?
No, you're absolutely right. And even, in fact, even that generation, as you've shown in some of your documentary work, when you ask them what society they prefer, after having also seen the Yeltsin era, where the Russian people were just completely looted, I think you called it in the interview you did with Eddie, the period of innocence or something, the era
of naivete.
Of naivete. There we go.
Yeah.
Which is a great way to frame it. When you ask these people, it's very clear that a lot of them are still very much reminiscent and would much prefer the Soviet period, even in that stage of the generation that it was in. And one of the things that they often mentioned when you asked them why was the social component of it. You know, how people interacted with other people, the valuative system that dominated society.
Yeah.
And that's something that capitalism completely degenerates. And there's many ways in which it does that. You mentioned how the general narrative from bourgeois historians is that that period of collectivization where the people have a pride in what they do and they overexert themselves, not for the sake of making someone a small group of people rich and against their own will, but it's their willful activity to exert themselves in that way for society. There's a direct linkage between how the individual understands its interests and the interest of society. It's a genuine ethical life, what in Hegel's work you'd call the Sittlichkeit that's operative in society. And there's a deep pride to that, as you mentioned. And what the bourgeois historians do is just completely spit on that legacy, on the things that the people hold the most dear and the most sacred. The work that they did, the sacrifices that they made for a project that was larger than themselves and than their immediate family. And this is happening right now with my country and has been happening for years. We know that the Cuban Revolution occurred, and there was a great, what's often called a brain drain, what's been called sense of a brain drain, where most of the professionals fled. They saw their interest as being linked to the gusanos de corbata, as Martí called them, those neo-colonial overlords who allow foreign imperialist powers to loot their country and get rich off of the crumbs. A lot of the professionals saw their interests align with that class and they fled. And so in many leading universities like the University of Havana, the teaching staff in most departments were cut by at least in half. Most medical professionals were gone. And on the eve of this great flee of medical professionals and other types of professionals, Che Guevara and Fidel say we're going to be a society of professionals, of well-educated, cultured people, which is a very bold proclamation, as literally half of your professionals have fled. But within a few generations, they've created such a tremendous surplus of doctors that they begin to send them over to the farthest corners of the earth to save lives, to heal the sick, to teach generations of doctors in areas where they were denied access to medicine because of imperialism, and to do so free of charge, and for countries that did have wealth to do so on a scale method, so that if you're a wealthier country, you pay a different fee than if you're a poor country, if poor countries pay at all. In most cases, they don't. So what we've seen from the bourgeois media in reaction to these people that are literally considered heroes by not just the Cuban government, the will that Cuban government represents, which is the people, the people's will. The people consider these doctors doing these humanitarian missions, they consider them heroes. And how is it that the American media speaks of them? They speak of them as slaves.
Yeah.
Very similar to how that Soviet generation is spoken of. So they're going to try everything they can to tear down anything that is sacred for us working people trying to build a new world that's not based on this elevation of capital as the supreme God that has supremacy over all aspects of life. And the vast majority of people in communist countries do not fall for it. The vast majority of people in Cuba do not fall for it. That doesn't mean that there's not different forms of dissatisfaction, but because it's such an educated society, because the government, what little they have, they do use it to develop the medicines, they do use it to promote education. It's a population that understands that Cuba's difficulties are rooted in the imperialist blockade that has been ongoing for 60 plus years, that has been condemned for more than 3 decades straight by basically every single country on the planet at the United Nations General Assembly every time it is voted on. The only 2 countries that usually vote against it is the United States. So, of course, the one imposing these unilateral coercive measures, and the bastard child of U.S. and British imperialism, the Zionist Nazi, very clearly, I think, a Nazi state of Israel. So it's been clear why they do that from the start. They cannot have under the nose of the greatest empire in human history a successful socialist experiment 90 miles away from the coast of the U.S. Keys. And they've said it explicitly. If you look at the memorandums that people like Lester Mallory draft in the early 60s, the idea is, well, the revolution is extremely popular. The people are, in line with the revolution. The only way that we can overthrow this government is by strangling them economically. To use the expression that I believe it was Nixon or Reagan in a conversation with Kissinger would later on use with Chile, let's make their economy scream. Let's make the conditions as difficult as possible on this small island that's obviously dependent on trading with other countries in order to obtain the things that they need. Let's make it as difficult as possible because that's going to breed dissatisfaction. And then on the basis of that dissatisfaction, we'll foment color revolutions and promote NGOs and different sorts of groups. And they've spent over the last 2 decades more than $1 billion promoting anti-Cuban government media in Miami, in Tampa, but also in the island itself, and promoting various people in the underground hip hop scene to speak against the government. And as someone who is Cuban, who's who was raised on the tradition of the music coming out of the island, these are people that, interestingly enough, 15, 20 years ago when they were singing, they were praising Cuba. I never heard a song from, people like Gente de Zona or La Charanga Banera, out of which the main singer went to Gente de Zona. I never heard one song condemning Cuba. There's even songs like praising Palestine. There's songs condemning U.S. imperialism, condemning the values that people are guided by in the U.S. But it just so happens that after billions of dollars are spent and millions are filtered into these groups that then end up developing connections with the most far-right elements of the Republican Party, embodied, of course, by the Cuban mafia in South Florida. It just so happens that after all that occurs, these people suddenly start singing against the government and criticizing the government, and then you have the Padre Vida song and all this stuff. So it's been a hybrid warfare that the U.S. has waged on Cuba, like it has on any other country that has been bold enough to, after their people winning a struggle for political power, affirm that they're going to take their own sovereign path, and specifically a socialist one. And this hybrid warfare has included, of course, this heinous blockade. It's included the actual invasions on Cuba, of course, the Bay of Pigs. It's included biochemical attacks like the African swine flu that developed in the 1980s. It has included terrorist campaigns like Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Garriles that blew up a plane killing 70-something people, a Cuban plane. It's included, an ideological war. It's included many different facets. It's included the Operation Northwoods, where the U.S. was planning to bomb Miami, Tampa, and Washington, and then blame it on Cuba to ferment consent towards waging an even more profound war against Cuba. So they've tried by every means necessary to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. They tried to kill Fidel like 700 times, and they still fail. And then somehow the people have the gall to say, oh, the Cuban people hate communism. They hate their socialist government. If they really hated it, don't you think that after the immense pressures and the billions of dollars the U.S. has spent in trying to drown Cuba and make it fail, don't you think that would have actually created the conditions for what they hoped, which is the people getting dissatisfied with the government and the revolution and overthrowing it?
Exactly.
Why is it that hasn't happened at all? And the furthest that they've gotten was July 11th, 2021, when a couple thousand cats hit the streets. And then as soon as Diaz-Canel said revolutionaries hit the streets, they all scattered like the rats that they are, and left. And within a couple days, hundreds of thousands of pro-revolution Cubans hit the streets, but none of that gets covered in the media. You get the news cycle for the whole week is when 100 people went to go protest in Santiago, in one of the eastern provinces, a couple weeks ago. But they don't mention that like the month before, there was tens of thousands of Cubans protesting against the Israeli genocide in Gaza and expressing solidarity on the basis of the Cuban Revolution with the people of Palestine. So it's all distortions, lies, manipulations, half-truths, omitted facts that are essential to understand what is happening. And all of this is done precisely to build the foundation, the argumentative base for their actually baseless narratives that are really just turning reality on its head and used to legitimize the criminal actions that the U.S. is waging against Cuba, and not just Cuba, every other country that exists outside of the sphere of influence of empire.
Yeah, well, the overwhelming support for governments in most communist countries that you mentioned is one of the reasons why the West has to wage this kind of asymmetrical informational warfare in these countries and kind of be deceptive. It reminds me of how during the solidarity movement in Poland, right, and the entire basically period of collapse of the USSR. Basically, nobody was calling for the open restoration of capitalism. And that's because that would have never been accepted by large amounts of the population. Basically, the most right-wing forces in these countries were marketing themselves as socialist, but they were marketing themselves as like some sort of idealistic socialism that's going to work and not have to hurt people ever, which obviously we know now amounted to capitalism, right? The biggest example is probably the Solidarity trade union movement in Poland, which ended up overthrowing the Communist Party there. It was marketed as a socialist trade union, as a truly socialist trade union that will be independent from the bureaucratic Communist Party apparatus, and it will change society for the better towards real socialism. And what that ended up doing was just restoring capitalism against the will of the people. It was a deceptive move. In the Soviet Union, like the same thing was the case. Nobody was calling for the open restoration of capitalism until like the very, very, very end. Up until then, it was all about perfecting socialism, right? Yeltsin was singing the praises of Vladimir Lenin just several years before he became president of the Russian Federation, and was saying that everything about the Soviet Union was horrible because he knew he wouldn't be able to get away with saying, I stand for the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union. Nobody would have allowed that. And even we can look at, of course, the referendum that was held towards the end of the Soviet Union, general referendum across most of the Soviet republics, asking if they wanted to keep the Soviet Union intact, and the vast majority of people said yes. And the Soviet Union, unfortunately, there's even because of the way the Soviet Union quote unquote collapsed. It was dismantled basically unilaterally by the leaders of by Yeltsin representing the Russian Federation, and the leader of Belarus and Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, at the time. They just unilaterally decided essentially that they were going to end the Soviet Union. And that's why there's actually an entire organization in Russia which has actually now been registered as an extremist organization, because they're a little wacky in what they've been doing, but they don't even recognize the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they say that the Russian Federation is a fictitious state that doesn't actually exist, because the Soviet Union was dissolved completely illegally, so that was done that way because it could have never been done no matter how many economic problems there were during the period of stagnation, no matter how many problems even emerged under the Gorbachev period, even though a lot of people had problems with that, and rightfully so, they still were not willing to sacrifice the Soviet Union or the idea of socialism. And so it had to be overthrown through a lie. But I'd like to, we're getting some super chats now, and from Battle Cossack, and I'd like to address maybe some of the questions he's putting forward, because they are very interesting, and I think we could have a discussion about it. The first one is about, he says his history teacher said that Gorbachev wanted to replicate what China did, but it didn't work out because of socialism, because socialism just doesn't work. What's the difference between Deng's market reforms and Gorbachev's? I'll give my position on this pretty quick, and then I'll hand it over to you, Carlos. But basically, the difference, essentially, I think, is that Gorbachev's idea of market of transitioning socialism from like what he called a command economy back then, and to what he considered to be market socialism. His conception was different from that of Deng, first of all. And second of all, it was different in the fact that Gorbachev's actions, were his ideas of political and economic reform were simply purely bourgeois, even though he didn't say it that way. I mean, there's some people that say that Gorbachev deliberately planned to overthrow the Soviet Union. Frankly, my position is that he was just kind of an idiot, and he allowed actual capitalist forces in society to flourish and outmaneuver him politically, because he thought that that was what democracy was, giving a platform to these capitalist forces within society that were growing, that were basically, seeded in society throughout the revisionist period and were given the green light to grow throughout the Gorbachev period. He thought giving them some sort of official recognition in the political system and the economy was democratic, even though these forces were more than willing to take power through undemocratic means, which was why the Soviet Union repressed them in the first place, because there can be no democratic reconciliation between the capitalist class and the working class when it comes to class conflict. So I think Gorbachev failed because he was, far more naive in his approach, and didn't really have an idea either of what he was doing. Deng, on the other hand, I don't know as much about the Deng reforms as I do know about the Gorbachev period. But as I understand, first of all, they were more tame, and they were done within the framework of a socialist plan still. But maybe, Carlos, you could add on what I said.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember a point that Lenin makes very clear, that under the socialist mode of life, politics becomes central. What under previous modes of life you could see as the most foundational areas, the economic sphere, the economic base of society, under socializations of the state, the political state. And so what that means concretely is that the most important thing for a socialist project, a state constructing socialism, is to sustain power on the people, to have a full expropriation of political capital from the previous forces of reactions, whether it's the feudal, semi-feudal classes or the capitalist class. And the central difference is that there was in the Soviet Union a political liberalization, and in China there was never a political liberalization. Political capital, as Mao refers to it, was always kept within the hands of the Communist Party. Yeah. The bourgeoisie was allowed to redevelop, it was allowed to grow. Bourgeoisies from other countries were allowed to come in and enrich themselves, but never did they get an inkling close to coming into a position of political power. And that, I think, was the central difference, that the liberalization that occurred in the Soviet Union included the political dimension when it can never include the political dimension. This myth that we have, that the more parties exist, the more democracy there is absolute, utter nonsense. All democracy means, if we trace it back to its etymological roots, is demos, which means common people, and kratos, which means the ability to rule over, the ability to have some authority, to have power. So democracy is, in essence, just the dictatorship of the people, the dictatorship of the working classes. It's a democratic dictatorship, as the Chinese have since called it, which means that any forces that stand over and against the interests of the people, that represent in their very being as a class the interests of capital, and that are always open to collaborating with imperialism, as was shown there in the dismantling of the Soviet Union, they cannot come anywhere near to political. As far as economic capital and economic quote-unquote liberalization, because there's not much liberty ultimately that stems from it, but if you ride the tiger as China has, you can get to it. But as far as economic liberalization, China sustained key industries under the control of the Communist Party, that is the People's State. To this day, some of the key industries, steel and others, are controlled by state-owned enterprises. And as far as the industries that did develop, they were very much under the supervision of the Communist Party. To this day, a percentage of every private enterprise, every major company, in accordance with its size, it has to have a certain number of Communist Party members within it to ensure that the growth of the company is tailored towards the common good of society at large, and that if the company grows, it also reflects itself in a raising of living standard for the working class. So that the growth that China has had, which is it's been a real productive growth, not the speculative growth that we've seen from the West that's just on the basis of parasitic rents and interest rates and stock buybacks, so that that real growth is one that also elevates the working people and society at large. So it's been very different. Markets have existed and markets do exist in China, and they were brought in. They were brought back in the reform and opening up process, because even before the establishment of the PRC in the communist-led regions of the country, there was still at the level of the economy, mixed economic forms of production. State or public production was primary. There was these other ones that were auxiliary and functioned and were mediated by the dominant one. And that is still the case. There's still markets, but the markets function dialectically in relationship with central planning, with the 5-year plans that they ultimately serve. And there's still private property. And that private property serves, again, dialectically as an auxiliary function, as a mediational. It gets mediated by the dominant mode of production, which is still socialist. It's still state-owned production aimed at producing higher living standards for the Chinese people and better life for the people that are ultimately in power over that state, which is the working class.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation, because like you said, political power is everything, right? Gorbachev's main mistake was just opening the doors to to the bourgeois forces in society for political power, because that was his warped idea of what democracy meant. When I think you made a good point about the ancient meaning of what democracy really is, right? It doesn't you don't have to have 5, 6 different political parties to be a democratic state. All a political party is a political representation of a certain class of society, and obviously, communism is if communism is to be democratic, then we would want the working class to be the only represented class in society, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But
Donald, can I say something real quick there?
yeah, go ahead.
This surprised my students every year. Every semester I cover it.
Yeah.
Do you know what the Greeks thought of political parties and elections? They did not think it was a mechanism, an instrument for democracy. On the contrary, they understood that those forms of elections, pluriparty elections, are a form of doing politics, an instrument of politics from within aristocracy. Why would these sorts of elections produce aristocracies when there's multiple parties? Well, precisely because whoever ends up having money and resources and generational training in rhetoric and sophistry ends up winning. So the interest of the people, the common interest, what democracy means, is not going to rule. The conditions are always going to be there for the mass of people to be deceived by those that have economic power. So already the Greeks understood that this idea that we have, that we just tie democracy to elections and to multi-parties and the ability to vote for one ruling party over another, it couldn't be any farther from democracy. They understood that that was an aristocratic mode and political technology. It had nothing to do with democracy. And the founders of the U.S., they knew their Greeks. They knew their Greeks very well. And they knew that the sort of political mechanisms that the bourgeois revolutions brought about, if you look at it, and you trace it genealogically back to the origins of Western democracy in Greece, those mechanisms that they ended up calling democracy were considered to be anti-democratic mechanisms of political practice in the societies that we claim to adhere to that democratic, that we claim to trace our democratic legacy back to.
That's actually interesting. I didn't know that about the ancient Greeks. I know, obviously, one of the most interesting things about the United States being a two-party system is that the forefathers of the United States literally said that would be probably one of the worst things to do, have parties in politics, because for exactly the reason you just mentioned, because it leads to aristocratic rule of society and the consolidation of special interests, right? So. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and another thing in connection to the China the difference between the China experience and the Soviet one is that under the Gorbachev period, obviously they were already starting to open up joint stock companies in the Soviet Union that operated outside of the purview of the economic plan, which, as I understand, that was not something that the Chinese did in the in their key industries, as Lenin said it, the commanding heights of production,
Right.
and that basically gave, basically surrendered tons of economic power to foreign companies, and they were happy to do it. Obviously, they thought it was great. They were praising Gorbachev, saying everything that, Gorbachev's the best, reforming the Soviet Union's going great, because it meant that they had an opening to overthrow socialism and conduct the kind of exploitation that we saw in the 1990s of Russia's industry and its resources. And if like Carlos, you mentioned earlier in the live stream that we've done some documentary work. If anyone watching this right now wants to listen to some of the firsthand accounts of people who lived under socialism in the Soviet Union, you could check out our playlist. It's called Does Socialism Work? And we've got tons of interviews there with older people who lived in the USSR, and they have really only good things to say about it. I swear I don't like pick and choose the interviews. I have not met one person on the street who I've tried to gather an interview with who lived in the Soviet Union who has said oh, it was just absolutely terrible. I would never want anything like that to return. I have not run into one person just randomly talking to people on the street. And you can you could see that in the interviews, because they're not oh, everything was perfect. No, they were there were certain things that didn't work out the best, or there were times where there were shortages. Some people talk about that, but still, people remember that time very fondly. And if you compare it to what came after in the 1990s, then nobody will ever say that the 90s was better than the 70s or the 60s, even the 80s, when all that stuff was beginning. But yeah, Carlos, I think we're gonna have to cut the live stream short, unfortunately. I mean, I'm sure we could go for hours talking about this subject, but do you have any closing comments about what we spoke about, or any closing thoughts that you want to leave the audience with?
The most important myth to debunk is that socialism has always failed. And I think that's part of what we've tried to tackle here, show how popular it was with the people. And as you point to in the case of the Soviet experience, in order to dismantle it, you needed to have the most anti-democratic process possible, where there was a direct rejection of a referendum, and the people's will was anything but upheld in that dissolving the Soviet Union. So communism is not only popular, but in order to effect the counter-revolutions that they did, they had to be thoroughly top-down, thoroughly, I guess, foreignized. I don't know if that's a word, but they had to include a lot of foreign imperialist elements into the mix in order for those things to work. None of the counter-revolutions have been genuine, spontaneous of the people against a communist dictatorship. That is all nonsense. They've been lying to you, and the same people that lie to you are the people that keep you poor and miserated and drowning under debt slavery. So reject that. The legacy of socialism is tremendous. It is our legacy as working people, and not only us here in the U.S., not only can we achieve the same thing that our brothers and sisters in the global South and East have been able to achieve, even while under the boot of imperialism, but we can achieve, I think, much more, because we are that boot, that imperialist boot that has prevented the socialist struggles from around the world from flourishing as they would have organically and naturally. We have literally a world to win, and there's no reason to get down. We have to fight.
I agree 100%, Carlos. Thanks a lot for coming on the Revolution Report and discussing this really important topic with me. I thought the discussion was really good. Everyone watching, make sure to check out MidWestern Marx. They've got a website. They've got a YouTube channel, right? You guys have a YouTube channel? Right, a YouTube channel, TikTok, all over the place, all over social media. They're there making good content. trying to spread the truth about socialism and analyses on socialist theory and all that good stuff, like we're trying to do here at the Revolution Report. So definitely check them out. Also, if you want to go that extra step to support the Revolution Report, please check out our Patreon, see if you want to become a patron there. We've got some cool benefits for those who do. So once again, Carlos, thanks a lot for joining us on the Revolution Report. Everyone who's watching, thanks a lot for sticking with us. We hope you enjoyed the live stream, and workers of the world unite.
Thank you.